All right, so we are online on YouTube already. So everybody, I think we should start now. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm Iqbal Ahnaf. I'm a faculty member at the Center for Religious and Cross-Cultural Studies at CRCS, Gadjah Mada University. I teach religion, violence, and peace building, and on the issue of social movement. I'm very pleased to be your host today. So today we will continue our sessions on Judaism with Rabbi David Rosen. Thank you, Prof. David Rosen, for your time. And our topic today, that's the topic that I was taught today is on Jerusalem, I guess. So we will, is that right, David, Rabbi?
It is substantially right, but not completely, but I will be happy to clarify.
All right. So something related to Jerusalem. Probably we will be clarified, but this is the our second sessions, and please remind yourself that we will still have 2 more sessions tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. So this course on Judaism is organized by the collaboration between CRCS, ICRS, Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, ASAI, Asosiasi Studi Agama Indonesia, and supported by the Asia Pacific Institute. And we will soon invite Dr. David Rosens to start the lectures, but I would like to remind everyone that you can ask questions by typing on the chat box or making comments on our YouTube channels. And maybe later on, if we still have time, I might invite 1 or 2 participants to speak directly through Zoom. But because to save time, I think it is important that we make this efficient to make the questions preferred in the chat room. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor David Rosen to start. Please.
Thank you very much. I explained yesterday that because the first subject was so extensive, I'm going to use a little part of today to conclude the first presentation before moving on to the second one on Jerusalem, which will be very different in character, and I'll explain that. But allow me also to repeat my request yesterday to ask questions and even to interrupt me through the chairman if there's something I say that is not clear. There were some questions which were asked, which I saw subsequently on chat, that I didn't have the opportunity to reply to yesterday. So even before continuing on the first theme, I will still address some points which were missing yesterday or lacking in clarification. One very important question yesterday, which I didn't have the answer immediately for, was, when does the term Land of Israel appear? And I said that I didn't think it appeared within the Torah, and I was correct. It appears for the first time, Land of Israel, in the book of Samuel. And therefore it's used already before the split of the kingdoms between the northern kingdom known as Israel and the southern kingdom known as Judea. Already all the land was known as the Land of Israel. So that term is there in Samuel. It's used also in the book of Kings, in the book of Ezekiel, and in the book of Chronicles. Another question I was asked for further clarification with regards to the mikveh. A mikveh, you will remember, is the ablution pool. It's the source of the idea of baptism. It's a pool of waters. And during temple times, it was necessary to go and perform these ablutions, to dip in these waters before one went onto the temple and before one could participate in the temple service. And therefore, in priestly homes, which we've discovered in archaeological research here, especially in Jerusalem, those priestly families would have actually had a mikveh, or mikvaot in plural, in their home. But there were also public mikvaot, where people went in for these ablutions before they went up onto the Temple Mount to bring their offerings, etc. So in temple times, the mikveh was a daily facet of the priestly families and of anybody coming on to bring offerings to the temple. And therefore, this was part of ablutions. Since the temple has been destroyed, there is no required such immersion in waters, except for conversion, which we discussed, somebody who becomes Jewish, and the monthly immersion of a married woman during her childbearing years. 1 week after the end of her period, she immerses within the mikveh. A mikveh today has to be natural waters. The sea and the river are perfect mikvaot, but in most places the water is collected from natural rainwaters or from a spring with enough to cover the body, and that is considered to be 573 or so liters of water, and that's its application today. Another question I was asked was regards to, do Jews still perform offerings and bring those offerings as they did in the temple, often referred to as sacrifices? The answer to that is no. Once the temple was destroyed, the whole temple service came to an end. Therefore are no forms of offerings, sacrifices in the sense of those that were offered up in the temple. There was one other thing which I did not manage to get in yesterday within the cycle of the festivals. 2 points. One is I referred to post-biblical festivals. That's rather an inaccurate term, because obviously the Book of Esther, and even to some degree Maccabees, even if they are not part of the canon, are nevertheless still within a biblical context. When I used the term post-biblical, I meant post-Pentateuchal. In other words, not in the Torah. And that's the festivals of Purim and Chanukah. But with going back to the 3 pilgrim festivals, which are described in the Torah, these were the festivals, you recall, when all the people would come up to Jerusalem in annual 3 times a year pilgrimage and would bring their offerings. The third of the festivals I refer to is the Festival of Tabernacles. This is a 7-day festival, but it's followed by another holy day that is known as the 8th day of assembly. But in the cycle of Jewish reading of the Torah in the synagogue, excuse me, this cycle, which at one time was a triennial cycle, is now an annual cycle in which the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Torah, is read in the course of the year. So every Saturday, every Sabbath, another portion sequentially. And this is concluded at the festival, at the end of the Festival of Tabernacles, on the 8th day of assembly, that is also known as Simchat Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah. So then we conclude the reading of the Torah and we start it again, once again in an annual cycle. Okay, I think I've covered questions and matters that I know were still not completed in the presentation yesterday. Now, to conclude the first presentation, however, on Judaism as a way of life, I want to refer to daily religious practices. So the one daily practice that we have referred to, but I now will refer to more explicitly, is prayer. And while prayer is not mandated in the written Torah, the oral tradition understands this to flow from Pentateuchal references, and Jewish tradition understands a requirement of prayers now reflecting the offerings that were brought to the temple. As a result, there are 3 daily prayers: the prayer at night, in the morning, and in the afternoon. Very often, you will find that in synagogues where Jews come together to pray, the afternoon and the evening service will come together. So that very often people will be going to synagogue twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening for the afternoon and evening prayers together. It is not obligatory to go to synagogue. It is considered desirable and meritorious to pray together as a group, a quorum. The Hebrew word is minyan, of 10 males, according to Orthodox practice. We will discuss later or tomorrow the liberal streams of Judaism, which don't require it exclusively to be male, but count women in terms of the quorum. But the Orthodox practice is 10 males, and there are certain parts of the liturgy which can only be recited when you are together as a quorum, and that includes the reading of the Torah. So the reading of the Torah from a scroll, natural scroll of parchment, that can only be done in a quorum, and there are certain other prayers as well. But if you don't have a quorum, you can pray by yourself anywhere that is clean and appropriate, and there are 3 prayers a day. The main prayer within those services is known as the Amidah, the standing prayer. And that consists of blessings which have 3 components. One is praise of God, another is petition. Petition doesn't simply mean asking for things, it also means assessing whether one is worthy and what should be the priorities. And then the 3rd category is thanksgiving. So those 3 components are there within the Amidah prayer, which is the central prayer morning, afternoon, and evening. The other significant central text that is there in both morning and evening prayers is the Shema. The Shema, that's the first word of the first paragraph of 3 paragraphs that are recited, is taken, these 3 passages are taken from Deuteronomy chapter 6, Deuteronomy chapter 11, and from Numbers chapter 15. And the Shema I referred to yesterday very briefly is first and foremost the declaration of Jewish faith. In that sense, it's like the Shahada. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, and with all your soul. So that's that passage in Deuteronomy, however, that continues to talk about binding the words of this faith in God on your arm, on your hand, literally, and putting it as frontlets between your eyes and writing them on your doorposts and your gates. So the Shema, also that passage, the first passage says, you shall declare the words when you lie down and when you rise up. And on the basis of when you lie down and when you rise up, there is the Jewish practice to recite these passages known as the Shema, all 3 passages. So they are contained both within the morning service and within the evening service. And generally, Jews will recite the Shema again before they go to bed, so that it's recited in the morning and the evening. You will have seen the picture on the very nice flyer for this series that shows a Jew with the phylacteries on his arm and on his head. And that is the Jewish literal understanding, therefore, of the meaning of the passage in the Shema, you shall bind them for a sign on your hand and for frontlets between your eyes, to mean that these passages from the Torah themselves, where this phrase is used, should be actually on your hand, on your arm, and between your eyes, on your head. And therefore understood to mean that when we bind these on to show that actions and thoughts should all be dedicated to God. And Jews put on these phylacteries, or the correct Hebrew word is tefillin, from the Hebrew word tefillah, meaning a prayer, the plural of tefillah. Jews put them on every weekday, not on the Sabbath and on festivals, but every weekday. And while it is a commandment in and of itself, it's generally done at prayer time. And therefore, when Jews pray the morning prayers, they have on these phylacteries. The 3rd of these paragraphs of the Shema from Numbers chapter 15 talks of the commandment to have fringes on the corners of your garments, as the Torah indicates, and that appears in some other places as well. And these fringes are there to remind us of God's commandments, to dedicate ourselves, and wherever we are and whatever we're doing, to try to live according to God's way and to be therefore conscious of the divine presence. And these fringes are both worn in a large prayer shawl that is placed on. If at the end, incidentally, you want me to put on the tefillin and the talit to be able to show you, please ask me and I'll be happy to do it at the end of today's session. But a smaller garment is also worn as an undergarment, so that even the large shawl known as a talit is normally worn only at morning prayers. The undergarment is worn throughout the day. Technically, it is only obligatory to have fringes on a four-cornered garment if you are wearing a four-cornered garment. But in order to be able to fulfill this commandment, observant Jews wear an undergarment with the four fringes on, and for prayer wear the shawl. The other thing that is referred to that I mentioned within the paragraph of the Shema, in fact, in the first two paragraphs, is about putting it for a sign on your doorposts and gates. And therefore, in a Jewish home, you will see on the right hand as you go in of the door, and on all the doors of the house except for the bathroom and any place which is not appropriate, but on all the doors will be these passages in a little box, normally a decorative box that is placed there, once again as a continuous reminder of the divine presence, that we should be conscious of God and living according to God's word and way. Another thing I will mention about daily practice are blessings. Before an observant Jew eats anything or drinks anything or even enjoys fragrance, he or she is required to make a blessing. There is a formula. For example, for a piece of fruit, you will say, "Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who has created the fruit of the trees." And a similar formula for such food, for drink, for scent, and also for events, even on natural events like thunder and on lightning, and certainly for any special occasion. And of course, with regards to festivals and the sanctification of the day on the Sabbath, which I referred to yesterday, there are blessings for all of these. Blessings are considered to be not only an expression of consciousness of God's gifts and of his blessings that we benefit from, especially food and drink, but they are also seen as being an acknowledgement that we are not deserving of God's gifts. In other words, that everything belongs to God, that we own nothing. In fact, the Talmud says that he who eats or drinks anything without making a blessing is like a thief. You have not acknowledged God's ownership, and therefore this should be a daily aspect. Something else I will mention daily that is a general mitzvah, you remember that word, commandment, is the mitzvah of tzedakah. Tzedakah is essentially zakat or sadaqah on a daily basis, which means giving charity, and of course can be formed in many ways, but nevertheless should mean that you give of your possessions for charitable causes. Traditionally, it has been a tenth. Our sages say you should never give away more than a fifth of your income so that you do not become dependent upon others. But it is very much part of the fabric of the commandments, because the vast majority of the commandments in the Torah are social commandments concerned with our responsibilities to our fellow human beings, and especially to the weak and the vulnerable, the needy, the orphan, the widow, the stranger. And indeed, in the famous discussion on the Talmud, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Talmud in a moment, there is a discussion as to what is the most important of all the commandments. Rabbi Akiva says it is to love your neighbor as yourself. And Ben Azai says, as important as that is, we must remember that every human being is created in the divine image, so you don't discriminate as to who is your neighbor, and that you don't say, because nobody was kind to me, I don't need to be kind to other people. And therefore we have to remember that we have to be gracious and charitable and respectful to every human being, because every human person is created in the divine image. The one last thing I'd like to say about Judaism as a way of life is on the subject of study as a value. This is very often based on the passage in Joshua, where you have the words that say, "And you shall reflect on it and therefore study it day and night." Study within the Jewish tradition is not seen as simply a means to gaining information and knowledge. It is seen as actually a religious activity, as important, if not more important, than prayer itself. And therefore, within the observant religious tradition, study was something you dedicated as much of your time as you could to. And if you were a businessman or you had a profession, you tried your best to find times for study, to be able to study God's word as revealed within the Torah and as understood within the oral tradition, which then will bring us to the Talmud, which I will just mention in a moment. The origins of institutional study probably emerged within the first exile in Babylon, where the Jews were exiled after the first destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. Their Jewish life took root as it was to take root later in the second exile to even a greater extent. We mentioned yesterday the influence of Babylonian culture in terms of the Jewish calendar. But there was a bigger challenge. It's reflected in the psalm, there by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. For the Jewish people, the destruction of the first temple was such a trauma, as it was indeed for the second temple, that they thought that perhaps this was the end of the story and that they were going to disappear altogether without the temple, without the priestly service, without this particular focus on Jewish life. But there were a number of leaders at the time, and most notable perhaps amongst them was the prophet Ezekiel, who brought the people together. And this is where apparently the synagogue started, meaning a place where people came together. And they came together first and foremost, not to pray, but to study, to get to know the words of Torah. Of course, while they were there, they were prayed. They prayed to thank God for his gifts. They prayed to hope for the restoration and for the return. They prayed for all their daily regards. But the emergence of the synagogue was primarily as a study center. And why was that so important? Because Ezekiel and the elders in exile understood that if you are going to survive when you are outside your land and when you are derooted from your cultural context, then the only way you can do that truly effectively is through knowledge, through people being not dependent upon a temple or on a priestly caste, but being the actual possessors themselves of their heritage and of their inheritance. And therefore it was important that people acquire that knowledge. And therefore the synagogue seems to have emerged within the first exile as an educational center, as a study center, and then continued when the people returned after the first exile and Jewish life was rebuilt in the Second Temple period. And therefore the synagogue was not just the place of prayer, it was first and foremost the study center. Another phrase for that within Hebrew is Bet Midrash. And Bet Midrash means the place where you expound the tradition and where it was particular study. And the focus of study was so important within Jewish tradition that already 2,000 years ago, during the Second Temple, we had a, if you like, a national educational system to educate people. So literacy, religious literacy, is something that is very ancient within Jewish tradition and very central. And within observant Jewish communities, people will try to continue studying the Torah and the Talmud and the commentaries on it throughout their lives as a religious duty, as a religious devotion, as a religious experience. And therefore you have the yeshiva, the word yeshiva, which is very often translated as seminary, means a place where you sit and study. And it's not just for seminary, it's not for the purpose of qualifications, it's not for the purpose of becoming a rabbi. It's for the purpose of knowing God's word, his will, getting into that world of the divine revelation, and therefore a value in and of itself. Now, that study, as I indicated, is both the written Torah and the oral Torah that expounds a written Torah. The oral Torah, as the word indicates, was originally communicated by word of mouth, and therefore reflected, if you like, a certain dynamism. But at a certain stage, so much develops in terms of understanding how you apply the written word to different contexts, to different situations, the halakha, the sharia, how it applies in practice, that it becomes enormous and it becomes a big library, like the library behind me, my library, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about in a moment. And so there was a need to have to write down the oral tradition. Even though it was meant to be oral, it needs to be written down. The first writing down of the oral tradition is known as the Mishnah, which was redacted and formulated by Rabbi Judah the Prince approximately in the year 200. But it reflects, therefore, the whole tradition coming through the prophets, coming, therefore, from Ezra and Nehemiah through the Second Temple period of expounding and understanding the tradition, the oral tradition, on the basis of the written text. But the Mishnah itself was, if you like, a selection. It's the central selection, but nevertheless, it wasn't an exhaustion of all the material. And therefore, it was discussed in the study centers that existed in the Second Temple period, both before the destruction of the temple and after the destruction of the temple. And therefore, after the formulation of the Mishnah in the 2nd century, which of course was without the temple, still the Mishnah was formulated within the land of Israel. Discussions started emerging. Now, by that time, the population in the land of Israel was very small, or was getting smaller and smaller and weaker. And the major center of Jewish life was in Babylon. And therefore, the major discussions took place both in the land of Israel and in Babylon. And the discussions on the Mishnah are known as the Gemara. Together, they make up the Talmud. So the Talmud is the essential oral tradition and the exposition of the oral tradition and the discussion of the oral tradition, all tracing itself to the written text in terms of its origin. But the Talmud also contains within it many things that are not part of halakha, not legal, to do with the way of life, but exposition of texts, homilies, legends, stories, good advice. Much of the homily and therefore of the legends is known as Agadah, that is Agadah as opposed to halakha. In other words, the non-legal as opposed to the legal segment of it. And this becomes an enormous corpus. So here's the paradox, that in order to try to understand the oral tradition, you write it down, but then you've got to expound on it, and it becomes larger and larger, and it becomes therefore difficult to be able to master. So there have to be, and moreover than that, the Talmud itself doesn't necessarily always come to a conclusion. You can have pages and pages of discussion on it. And so there was a need to be able to formulate, to redact the substance of the Talmud so that people can know what to do and how to live their lives specifically with regards to all the different aspects that we have discussed yesterday and today. So we have a situation of where codes are formulated and are written down, probably the most well-known of all of them, Maimonides' code in the 12th century. And then we have the Code of Jewish Law a few centuries later, which is based upon Maimonides' code, but formulated again. And so we have these codes, but the codes also become large, and therefore there is a need again for more succinct texts, for guides for people. But then there's something even more than that, and that is that life is changing all the time. There are new situations. Science, society is changing. There are new challenges for Jewish religious life, for religious life generally. So today in the modern world, there are all sorts of things, new innovations like genetic engineering, artificial insemination. All these are questions which people want to know, what is the right religious thing to do? How do we do it? So just as within the Islamic tradition, there is a fatwa where a recognized religious legal authority can respond to these questions. So there is the corpus within Jewish tradition of responsa. A question is asked, you will have scholars who will respond to it. Sometimes different scholars will disagree. A scholar can never say, God appeared to me in a dream, and this is what God says. Nobody will be taken seriously. You always have to argue your case based on the text. Okay, so let's just, a few questions with regards to the, I mentioned the word Agadah. Very often the word midrash is used as synonymous for Agadah. Generally, the works of midrash are homiletical expositions of the text. And therefore, we can put, generally speaking, midrash and Agadah in one section, enormously enriching, but most of it not necessarily relevant to the halakha, i.e. the sharia, which is therefore the legal corpus, the jurisprudence that is guiding people as to how to lead our lives. And the Mishnah was written down in the year 200, I mentioned. Now, as I indicated, the Talmudic discussions and debates, they're taking place both in the land of Israel and in Babylon. Therefore, we have actually two Talmuds. The Jerusalem Talmud of the discussions that took place here in the land of Israel, and the Babylonian Talmud of those within Mesopotamia, what is today Iraq. And the Babylonian Talmud is actually larger in terms of the content of discussion, and that is the main Talmud that jurisprudence uses to be able to arrive at conclusions as they pertain to the daily life of the Jew in accordance with the religious cycle. If there are questions with regards to what I've mentioned, please do interrupt me, but just before I conclude, I want to show you in my library these works. So over here, these white volumes, that's the Babylonian Talmud. Over here, these volumes, that's the Jerusalem Talmud. This is the Mishnah. So the Mishnah starts there. You have a Jerusalem Talmud, you have the Babylonian Talmud. Here are the codes. This is Maimonides. This is the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law by Joseph Caro, 16th century, if I'm not mistaken. And therefore, and then they have further commentaries on them. So to be able to master this corpus is not a small thing. And that is what, according to Jewish tradition, Orthodox tradition in particular, is a rabbi. A rabbi is one who has mastered this corpus at least well enough to be able to know where to go to if there is an issue in a subject to be able to address, and if he is a good scholar, to be able to issue a responsum on any question that arises. Perhaps I will pause here before I get on to Jerusalem for any questions on anything I've said with regards to Judaism as a way of life.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, this is a very orderly discussions. We have discussed the Jewish way of life, from ablutions, prayers, almsgivings, study, etc. And we have quite numbers of questions actually, and I have divided the questions into according to the topic that you have discussed. Some questions related to prayer. So there is a questions about the quorums for prayer. Is there any quorum for the prayer? And can women participate in the prayer?
Okay, perhaps would you like to give me maybe some more questions and I can answer them all together?
All right. So that's the question. First questions about prayers, about the number of the quorums and the place of women in the prayers. There are also many questions about the issue of almsgiving, charity. What amounts and who organize the distributions of the almsgiving? Is there any instructions in the Old Testament if there is a portions of 10% from the wealth to be paid for almsgiving? So there are questions about prayers and charity, and also questions about other issues not specifically mentioned in your talk earlier, but there's a friend here who asked about if God asked Abraham to go to Canaan, why is that? What does that mean? Why is there such instructions?
Sorry, I didn't understand. Please repeat that.
Yeah, I have to I have to go to the lines because it's the questions keep coming up, and maybe you can address the first two questions, and then I will summarize more the questions about prayers and almsgiving, and then
very good.
Yeah.
A quorum is, according to Orthodox practice, is 10 adult men, 10 males over the age of 13. Tomorrow we will discuss different streams within Judaism, and the non-Orthodox streams of Judaism count women in a quorum as well. So it's men and women. In Orthodox tradition, so when I go to prayers, I go to pray with a quorum every morning. On Sabbaths, I actually go to the Western Wall, to El Burak, where I pray there. But on weekdays, there's a synagogue where I go to. At the moment, incidentally, because of Corona, we're not praying inside the synagogue, we're praying outside in the garden. But whether it's inside the synagogue or in the garden, when I go to prayer, morning prayers, there are always women there. But men and women are separate in different areas. So women are not, within Orthodox practice, not considered to be obliged to have to pray every day, because according to Orthodox tradition, women have so many manifold responsibilities that one can't make the same demands of them. But nevertheless, many good, devout religious women want to pray every day, and they will be there at synagogues. But in an Orthodox synagogues, there will be a separation between the men and the women. Almsgiving, as I mentioned, is considered to be the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, speaks during temple times, of course, of giving a tenth, and it's considered to be appropriate to give a tenth of your disposable income. As I mentioned, the sages indicated that you should not give more than 20%, so it should be between that. Now, indeed, it's required within Jewish practice that in every town where you live, there should be almsgiving inspectors or gatherers who are appointed by the community and who are responsible for its dispensation. Within the modern world, we have structures and we have charitable organizations that are established to be able to do that. And of course, I mentioned yesterday with regards to certain festivals where there are additional encouragement to be able to give gifts to the poor. So giving to the poor should be throughout the year, but there are special times when one gives even more. A question how is the Shema and prayers taught? So this is all very interesting. I was born in England, and even though I came to live in Israel, came to Jerusalem at the age of 16 after high school, nevertheless, I didn't really speak Hebrew. But even though I didn't speak Hebrew until then, I learned to read and write Hebrew before I learned to read and write English. Who taught me? My mother. Mothers have been the first educators of the community. So even before I knew how to read and write English, my mother in England was teaching me how to say my prayers, how to be able to read and write Hebrew. And therefore the home, I mentioned yesterday, that while the synagogue and the study center are important, they are not as important as the home. The home is the central institution, both for religious celebration and for education. So somebody asked, is the Mishnah in comparison to the Torah? So I indicated to you, the Torah is a holy book. It's a text, and therefore the scroll of the Torah is considered to be sacred, and therefore has to be, we prefer even not to even touch it. It's therefore not to be touched with the hands if that can be avoided. Because the Torah is considered to be the literal word of God's revelation. The Mishnah is the oral Torah that is the exposition of the Torah and the Talmud further. And therefore, while its content is sacred, the text itself is not considered to be a sacred text. Somebody wants me to talk about Kabbalah. I will come to that a little bit tomorrow. At the moment, I've been focusing on Judaism as a way of life and of living, and therefore I have not dealt with those additional dimensions.
Going back again to the prayer and almsgiving, I'm not sure if you have addressed questions about place of women in prayers, and about
yes,
the
I have.
About
yes,
the 10% already. All right. About the 10% portions of the wealth. Is that right?
I did.
All right.
I did.
Okay.
Anything else?
Yeah, there are some more. Sorry, there are questions about Talmud specifically. What is the difference between Talmud and Midrash?
So Midrash, as I indicated, is the homilet, is generally used. The word Midrash means to expound. So it has been used in different ways, but generally when we talk of Midrashic material, okay, so before I was showing you the legal works. Over here, if you can see, this is actually the 5 books of Moses. And above that, I have midrashic materials. These are midrashic compendia, which are essentially homilies, expositions of the text. Sometimes it might have an halachic application, but generally speaking, it is agadic. It is basically developing ideas, reflections, concepts on the basis of the text. It's not essential in terms of daily observance, in terms of the way of life.
All right.
Anything else?
Yeah. And the Talmud, is Talmud accessible to common people? Not only is it exclusively for rabbis?
So as I was saying, it becomes problematic unless you've had a very good Jewish education. Most people today are not able to access the Talmud. So for a few reasons. So I'm taking now a folio. This is therefore one tractate of the Talmud. Tractate of the Talmud is here. You can see there is the text. And the text is the central part, the large letters, and it's written in Aramaic. Most Jews, the Babylonian Talmud written in Aramaic. Most Jews today don't know Aramaic. And then there are the commentaries on the side. This is written in a very special script called the Rashi script. And there's exposition. And then there are further expositions on the text. So today, to be able to master the Talmud, you have to be a scholar. And therefore, you don't have to have the title rabbi, but you certainly have to have a very good Jewish education. Most people, the Talmud is not accessible. And therefore, the best they can do is to go to a code of Jewish law or a succinct, a précis of Jewish law to be able to find how to behave on any given occasion. In other words, one of the examples we mentioned yesterday was on the festival of Sukkot, of tabernacles. How do you build a tabernacle? What is considered to be a sukkah? What are the requirements? So there are today manuals, and those manuals are based on the codes of Jewish law. But simple answer is the Talmud is too complex for most Jews to be able to understand.
So the common Jews, instead of reading the Talmud, they read the Midrash.
No, the Midrash, most Jews will not even be able to access Midrash in its original form. They might be able to do so because that's a little bit easier, but still Midrash tends to be also the field of scholarship. And these are ideas that the Midrashic ideas people will become familiar with through rabbis and scholars who will expound them and present them at a weekly sermon like a khutbah and something like this. So they will hear those ideas. But it's essentially the scholars that have the access to those written texts. Now, that's not the way it should be to have a scholarly class. It's not considered ideal in Judaism that you become dependent upon a rabbi to be able to expound the tradition. Everybody should be able to access it, ideally. But in practice, the vast majority do not have the knowledge to be able to access it.
All right. So I hope that's clear for the questions about that. There are other questions here. Like let's just look at some of them, and maybe we cannot address all of them. There is a if you can address these two questions. This is not very familiar to me. Can you see I'm highlighting the chat box there? In the perspective of Judaism, why did God ask Abraham to go from Ur to Canaan, from Ur to Canaan? Why Canaan?
Okay.
What's with the land of Canaan?
So this is not to do with Judaism as a way of life. This is to do with a biblical question. And all the questions yesterday that were submitted by Ezra Iskander and Laputri, I said I would refer to at the end of my third presentation tomorrow, because that's going to be the shortest presentation. And I'm happy to deal with other questions like this question about why did Abraham need to leave and go where he went to, or how Jewish tradition understands that then. There was, with the question with regard, sorry?
Yeah, would you like to choose to answer one of the questions in the chat box?
I'll be happy to. I'm not able to. I'm dependent on you. I can't see the chat box myself.
Oh, you cannot see it. All right. There is a.
If it's to do with the topic that we've discussed, then please go ahead.
There is a question from Mas Maufur. Does each school of Judaism have its own yeshiva or center of learning, or can they learn in one yeshiva?
There are various kinds of yeshivas, or the correct Hebrew plural is yeshivot, reflecting different standards, different capabilities. There are different styles of scholarship, but they are not schools of jurisprudence like you have within Islam. They are, the distinctions are very minimal and may have more to do with the general world outlook and culture from which the teachers and therefore, as a result, the students come from. But generally, a traditional yeshiva is a place where you are studying Talmud and commentaries. Now, in more modern context, there's been an introduction of more thought, which would be both midrash, might be mystical thought, might be ethical teachings, etc. will expound it. But these are all additional areas in addition to the main core syllabus, which is the Talmud and commentaries.
All right.
There's one more question I saw. Someone was asking about a list of blessings. So the daily prayers I mentioned, I referred to the Amidah, the central standing prayer with the three different aspects of blessings of praise, petition, and thanksgiving, and of the Shema. But there are other prayers around it that connect these, and there are psalms that also introduce those prayers. And therefore, and the prayers change. I mentioned that there are 3 Amidah prayers a day, but on Sabbath there are 4, and on festivals there are 4, and on Yom Kippur there are 5, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which we spoke about the days of awe, the prayers are extensive. So the whole spectrum of Jewish prayers is an anthology, and therefore we have prayer books, known in the Hebrew word as a siddur. In the Siddur, you have all the prayers for all different occasions. So all the different kinds of prayers we've been discussing, all the different kinds of blessings we've been discussing are to be found within the Siddur. So I think I will now conclude this, which has been the extension of my first presentation. So it's gone on quite a long time. And I'm now going to go on to Jerusalem. And I hope that I have allowed enough time to be able to get through the presentation on Jerusalem. So this is going to be a different presentation on my part because I'm going to read a text. I'm going to read the text because I'm going to quote from different sources in different books that we have already referred to, because I want to speak about Jerusalem in the Jewish mind. In other words, what did Jerusalem mean and what does it mean to Jews? I'm less concerned with the history, though obviously the history is relevant. I'm more concerned with trying to understand and present to you what Jerusalem means to Jews. So Psalm 122 is perhaps the most Jerusalemic, the most Jerusalem of all the Psalms. And it expresses the pilgrim's excitement on arrival in Jerusalem. And it reveals something of the unique character and place that Jerusalem has occupied in the life and consciousness of the Jewish people. The gathering together from among all the tribes, especially from the pilgrim festivals, which we have mentioned, embody the remarkable vision ascribed to David, whose appreciation of the need for a central geographic focus around which the disparate components of Israelite society could rally, served as a prototype for, like, Washington, D.C. or Canberra, the idea of creating a new focus that unites all the different elements within the broader society. However, this vision appreciated not just the need for a geographic capital that the various tribes could view as their own, but also of the necessity to guarantee this unity as a spiritual one, a vision only realized with the construction of the temple by David's son, Solomon. The remarkable national cohesion provided by Jerusalem was expounded by the sages of the Talmud in a comment on one of the phrases on this psalm, on Psalm 122. It says, "Rebuilt Jerusalem is like a city joined together." The Hebrew word for joined together comes from the word from friend, chaver, one who is joined together. Accordingly, the rabbis expounded on the phrase, declaring that Jerusalem as a city bound together means a city that makes all the community friends. Jerusalem is also known as Zion, referred to in the book of Kings. It's also known as the city of David, referred in the second book of Samuel. It was therefore seen not just as a place divinely chosen for the monarchy, expanded to contain the Temple Mount, also known as Mount Moriah. It was viewed as being the site of the unique divine dwelling in this world, known as the city of God, to be identified with a location referred to in the book of Deuteronomy, quote, "The place he has chosen from among all your tribes to place his name there. There you shall seek his sanctuary and come there to bring your offerings." Thus, Jewish tradition viewed this site as the place where intrinsic holiness actually connects heaven and earth, as a kind of a spiritual vortex from whence holiness emanates to the world at large. In keeping with this idea, another rabbinic interpretation of the aforementioned phrase in Psalm 122, "Jerusalem is a city joined together," understands it to refer to the connection between the celestial Jerusalem on high and the terrestrial Jerusalem. The first chapter of Tractate Kelim, a tractate of the Mishnah, gives halachic jurisprudential substance in terms of laws of ritual purity to this idea. And it talks of a series of emanations from the Holy of Holiness, Holy of Holies, to the Temple Mount as a whole, to the land of Israel as a whole, to the world as a whole. God's presence is everywhere, but in some special way, it is uniquely to be found at that place where the Holy of Holies stood. And thus Jerusalem is presented, like in the historian Philo from the Second Temple period, as the umbilicus mundi, the belly button of the world, the center of the world. So accordingly, Jewish tradition identified many aspects of biblical narrative with this location, such as Abraham's demonstration of faith and his willingness to sacrifice his son for his faith, Jacob's dream of a ladder connecting heaven and earth together, are all seen as having taken place at that particular location. And Jerusalem is described with hyperbolic, exaggerated description of its beauty and of its glory. Judaism ascribes 70 names to Jerusalem, attesting to her spiritual significance and beauty. The destruction of the temple and Jerusalem as a whole, the first temple being destroyed in the year 586 BCE by the Babylonians, was thus seen as the ultimate catastrophe and is described in the Book of Lamentations as the ominous day of Jerusalem. And the city's own condition symbolizes the humiliation of the land, but not just of the land, the humiliation of the people and their exile, graphically described in the Book of Lamentations. And also in Psalms like Psalm 137, which I referred to earlier, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its ability. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not raise Jerusalem above my greatest joy." Nevertheless, as I mentioned yesterday, the destruction and exile are seen as only a temporary situation in biblical and prophetic literature, which express the total trust in God's love and commitment to his eternal promise to return the exiles as foretold in the book of Leviticus, ultimately bringing about the city of Jerusalem's restoration and reunification with the people. Accordingly, chapters of consolation in the book of Isaiah contain an abundance of expression of fervent love for Zion, for Jerusalem on the one hand, and on the other hand, descriptions in poetic style of its anticipated future greatness and splendor with its expected restoration. That prophetic view sees not only a physical glory, but a sublime religious spiritual significance, both with regards to the exile's return and to the end of days, in other words, the Messianic era. But as I've already indicated, the unique national role that Jerusalem provided led to a remarkable identification of the city with the people themselves. This is most dramatically demonstrated in passages from the prophets concerning the city after its destruction by the Babylonians in the year 586. In the book of Lamentations, it says, Jerusalem has sinned grievously. How does Jerusalem sin? Obviously, it's not Jerusalem the city, it's the people. Therefore, her fall is terrible. When while the city is portrayed as a grieving widow, a bereft mother, a ravished daughter of Judah, the daughter of Zion, she is also the very embodiment of the humiliated and desolate people itself. So, Lamentation says, she dwells now among the nations. How does Jerusalem dwell amongst the nations? Obviously, it's not Jerusalem, it's the people, but the people are described as Jerusalem. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is none to comfort her. Accordingly, Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, addresses the people as Jerusalem. And he expresses God's promise to the people, go and proclaim in the ears of Jerusalem. Obviously, that means to the people, saying, the Lord says, I have remembered the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, your dedication to me, how you followed me in the wilderness. And therefore I will not forget my promise to you. And Isaiah continuously identifies the city and the people together and declares that God will once again say to Zion, you are my people. So that's explicit, the identification. I'm not sure if anything exists like that in any other religious culture or secular culture. Athenians did identify very much with the city of Athens, but to be able to see the city as having a personality that is them, and that is exiled, let alone redeemed, I don't think that occurs anywhere else. So it emphasizes how totally identified the people was and is with Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not just a place, it is the actual heart, the pulsating heart of the Jewish people. Thus, the rabbis declared that one should really mourn for the destruction of Jerusalem every day, but that is too much to ask. And therefore, there were all kinds of instructions that rabbis made, halachic instructions, to remember the destruction of Jerusalem. One of these is that when you build a house, don't finish it off. There should be something left unfinished to remember the destruction of Jerusalem. You may know from a Jewish wedding that at the end of this wonderfully joyous celebration, the groom breaks a glass. That is generally identified as a memory, in memory of the destruction of Jerusalem. In other words, even at the most chiefest joy, then the Jerusalem is remembered. And that is the expression that is used. And of course, at the end of every major celebration, but especially at the end of the Passover meal, which we discussed yesterday, at the end of the most solemn day of the year, the Day of Atonement, we say next year in Jerusalem, expressing the anticipation of the return. And within the liturgy, and especially on the days of remembering the destruction, which we spoke about yesterday, Tisha B'Av, the day, the almost 25 hours of complete fasting, no food nor drink, which is a day of mourning, the Black Fast. There are various passages that we recite that express that idea and that centrality. And even on the daily prayers, there is a continuous, in all three daily prayers, the expectation of the return to Jerusalem. Every grace after meal, the return for Jerusalem. Where Jews pray, they pray towards Jerusalem. This, which is the Qibla Kadima for Muslims, is the only Qibla for Jews. It's the only direction of prayer, and therefore emphasizes that focus. And of course, the whole calendar is orientated towards it. So therefore, for example, you pray for the rains, even if you live in the Southern Hemisphere, nevertheless, your liturgy is orientated by the Northern Hemisphere, by the land and by the situation of Jerusalem. So there were also practices of when people were buried anywhere that they would have a little bit of earth from Jerusalem affecting that connection and that bond. It's understandable that the bitter experience of persecution and suffering that Jews experienced in Jerusalem itself, and as a consequence of the destruction of Jerusalem, led to a perception in the Jewish mind of the relationship between the Jewish people and the city as an exclusive one. However, already in Solomon's original prayer at the dedication of the temple, reported in the Book of Kings, the place of the temple in Jerusalem is seen as having universal significance and appeal. I now quote from Solomon's dedicatory prayer in the Book of Kings, 1 Kings chapter 8. Also the foreigner who is not of your people Israel, who may come from a far country for your name's sake, for when he will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and outstretched arm will come to pray at this house. You will hearken from the heavens, from the abode of your dwelling place, and may you do all that which the foreigner calls upon you for, in order that all the nations of the earth will know your name to revere you, as do your people Israel, and to know that your name is designated on this house that I have built. So Solomon envisages the temple in Jerusalem, and therefore Jerusalem having universal appeal and significance. And indeed, the prophets envision a restored Jerusalem with a temple at its center as serving a universal destiny in the Messianic era. The prophet Zechariah describes how Jerusalem will become the global focus of pilgrimage for all nations that will come up to Jerusalem, especially to celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles. Thus, in keeping with the vision of Isaiah echoed by Micah, in which the place named the mountain of the house of the Lord and the house of the God of Jacob are identified with Zion, Jerusalem, it is here from which learning, justice, and peace emanate to all the nations of the world. And Isaiah's vision of the Messianic era has the people declaring, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he will instruct us in his ways, and he will walk in his paths. From Zion shall go forth, and the word of the Torah from Jerusalem. So in this light, I would like to close my remarks on the significance of Jerusalem in the Jewish mind with my own little midrash, homiletic exposition of Psalm 122, which I opened this presentation with. Verse 6 of this psalm is often translated as, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, may those that love you prosper. However, the first word in Hebrew of that phrase, sha'alu, is more literally translated as seek the peace of Jerusalem. And the rest of the verse does not necessarily read as expressing a wish, but more as a statement. Therefore, a more literal translation would be, seek the peace of Jerusalem, those that love you shall prosper. Yet such a claim seems very strange and paradoxical and almost bitter irony in terms of historical reality. Our sages declared that 10 measures of beauty came down to the world, and 9 of them went to Jerusalem, trying to extol its glory. But they also said 10 portions of pain came down to the world, 9 went to Jerusalem. And indeed, has there ever been a city that has known more pain than Jerusalem to more traditions around the world and has experienced more continuous bloodshed? Has any city had more tears shed over her than Jerusalem? How can one say that those that love her prosper? They don't seem to have prospered. However, both the Psalm's description of the role of Jerusalem as well as the exposition of the verse that we already mentioned, as Jerusalem bringing a city that brings people together, provide a deeper understanding of the phrase, the peace of Jerusalem. It means essentially the peace of Jerusalem, the peace of unity that embraces diversity. So it means in this light, verse 6 means that when we can embrace that diversity in Jerusalem, then we really prosper. And this really is our challenge still today. We have to learn, for all of us, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, that Jerusalem is of significance for others, not only for ourselves, that it has indeed even universal significance beyond even our own particular traditions. And when we can learn to respect that attachment and to understand its importance for each and every one of us, then we will truly prosper. So I'm very happy to bring my comments on Jerusalem in the Jewish mind to an end. I'm very happy to respond to any questions on that topic as well.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I would like to invite maybe 2 participants to ask questions on Zoom. If you have questions about Jerusalem, please. Anyone who want to ask questions about Jerusalem, the significance of Jerusalem?
Raise hand.
Pak Leo, you wanna?
No, I mean, I just encourage people to raise hand. Choose the facility of raise hand, so we can see.
Well, if there are no questions on Jerusalem, you're very welcome to ask questions on other aspects of my presentations.
All right.
Abdullah Musli, Pak Musli. Yeah, please, Pak Musli. You can unmute yourself.
Pak Musli.
Thank you.
Please, Pak Musli.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, by the person. You have mentioned earlier about the codes which was compiled by Maimonides. My question here is that sorry, did Judaism own or possess another kind of codes in theological conducts before Maimonides conceptualized it? I mean, did Judaism what does the principle of the theology before Maimonides conceptualized it? Thank you very much.
I'm not quite sure what theology has to do with it, but the codes are based upon the Talmud and are essentially concerned with the jurisprudential content of the Talmud, the halachic, the halacha, the law, the legal passages within the Talmud. And there are already, this was already done in centuries before, or in the centuries before Maimonides. There is Rabbi Al-Fasi, as the name suggests, this is to do with Fez and therefore came from Morocco, and his attempt to be able to make the Talmud more succinct and accessible and provide rulings. And there are, after the period of the Talmud, there was the period of the institutions in especially Babylon, where the leaders were known as the Gaons, Gaonim in plural, which means the sages, and they would also did various redactions of it. Al-Fasi's reduction is more substantial, but Maimonides' redaction in the 12th century was the most succinct, but it was still too much for access, and there were still further discussions on it. So the one that's really used most extensively is Joseph Caro's Code of Jewish Law, on which there are glossaries from other scholars at other time. Rabbi Moses Isserles is living in Poland, who wrote his commentary on Joseph Caro, who obviously, as his name indicated, was within the Muslim world, and there were differences perhaps in custom, but essentially the Code of Jewish Law is the main code, the first code, that a rabbi who is dealing with a question, an application, will consult. So that Code of Jewish Law is this work here. This over here is Maimonides. Above is an earlier code called the Arba Turim. I won't get into too many details with regards to names and different corpuses, because that gets a little bit too esoteric. But the main code is the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, which means the laid table of Joseph Caro, based upon Maimonides, but with many additional aspects and even with certain, if you like, qualifications.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else wanna raise hand? Okay, Mas Andika Wibisono, please.
Yes, I would like to as the rabbi about the Amidah prayer. I read some articles and from Sefaria about Birkat Hamanim in Amidah prayer. Could you tell us more about Birkat Hamanim, which is a part of Amidah prayer? Thank you, Rabbi.
So as I mentioned, the Amidah prayer is primarily praise, petition, and thanksgiving. It is also known as the 18 blessings. And when it was formulated as a prayer with these three components, but 18 blessings. The petitionary prayers include blessings which mean thanksgiving, or expressions, as I say, they're petitionary prayers, but petitionary prayers in relation to things for which we thank God. So, for example, there is the prayer for knowledge and understanding. So it includes a recognition that all knowledge comes from God. May God allow us and favor us with that capacity for discernment. It therefore acknowledges that God has created the world and us with a capacity for repentance and atonement. May he inspire us to be repentant for anything that we have done wrong, and therefore to be returned to him. So the majority of the main substance are prayers along those lines. At the time, in the first centuries, at the time when this prayer was being formulated, in Mishnaic period, was a time not only of enormous trauma after the destruction of the temple, but it was a time when there were all kinds of sects emerging within the Jewish community, and many challenging the authority of the rabbis. And we'll talk about a little bit of that tomorrow in more detail. And there were those that were seen as also particularly as collaborators with the Roman authorities. So there were both political, if you like, and theological challenges. And therefore there was felt a need to be able to issue some kind of exhortation, condemnation of those who indulge in what was seen as heretical theological ideas that threatened the community. And therefore a 19th blessing was added in, which essentially therefore dissociates the community from such sectaries and asks for God's protection, and that they, as a result, face the negative consequences for such heretical expressions. In the course of a matter of relatively short period of time, it no longer became relevant, and therefore the context changed, and therefore very often has simply become understood more within the main body of that particular clause, that one of blessing, to mean more those that seek to divert the community from the right path and who pursue evil and do evil, and therefore is seen much more as an exhortation of evil doing and a call for God's protection in that regard. It's important to bear in mind that the rabbis of the Talmud were very concerned that the condemnation of evil should not mean that one disassociates, that one comes to the conclusion that a person themselves is inherently evil, because every human being is created in a divine image. There is a very famous story told in the Talmud of one of the great sages and one of the major formulators of the Mishnah, or if you like, architects, formulators of it is a good word, the name of Rabbi Meir, who had a wife who was a great scholar, a great unusually gifted woman scholar by the name of Bruria, who herself was a daughter of a great scholar, one of the rabbis. Rabbi Meir came across some rather negative people who were troubling him and giving him a lot of difficulty, and he cursed them. And his wife berated him, and she says, "Don't you know it's written in Psalms?" I think that's Psalm 150, if I'm not mistaken. Sins shall be eliminated for the world, and there shall be no evil people anymore. It doesn't say sinners shall be removed from the world. It says sins. You should not be cursing them. You should be praying that they repent from their ways and become good. And he acknowledged that his wife had taught him a very important lesson lesson, and he prayed that they would repent and change their ways, and they did so. In other words, when we therefore have that passage within the Amidah that therefore exoriates evil, it is evil we are exoriating and condemning, and ultimately hoping that God will turn the evil away from their ways and to be good and righteous.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
All right. There are a couple more hands up, but I would like to read these questions on Jerusalem from the YouTube. So let me read, Rabbi. So questions about Jerusalem. First, if Jerusalem is very important, how should the diaspora Jews behave toward Jerusalem? Is it wrong if a Jew does not crave to come to Jerusalem? Second,
So, yes.
yeah, why did the Jews have to constantly remember the destructions of the temple of God in Jerusalem? Also, someone want to check.
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Why did the Jews have to constantly remember the destructions of the temple of God?
Okay.
And one friend here also wonder if you live in Jerusalem yourself.
Right.
Where in Jerusalem?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I live in Jerusalem, so I send you blessings from Jerusalem. In fact, I'm on the upper level on a deck of our home. I can actually see the Haram al-Sharif, and I can see Al-Aqsa, the place where we believe the temple stood. And therefore, I'm very, very blessed to live in this holy city and with such a wonderful view. So what I tried to present to you about Jerusalem was that Jewish tradition sees that location as uniquely holy, and therefore the temple was a unique location. And therefore the people identified themselves with that location. First of all, we discussed yesterday the 3 pilgrim festivals, the people coming up, that sense of unity. The temple was seen as an expression of God's indwelling, and therefore the destruction of the temple was a national trauma. And if something is really very, very dear to you, you don't want to forget it. And therefore, if you've lost someone that's dear to you, you try to remember that person in some way. So if this location, especially when this location has acquired such a personality that you identify yourself with it, it's natural that you are going to continuously remember the pain associated with it and hope for the joy, and therefore hope for its restoration. Moreover, yesterday I mentioned to you that the whole of Jewish way of life, as revealed in the Torah, is revealed specifically to be lived in the land, where Jerusalem is the center, where the temple was the center of Jerusalem. So the whole Jewish way of life is connected here. It's meant to be here. Now, we also stated, and it's also very important to Judaism, that God is everywhere, and that you can live a good and righteous life wherever you are in the world. But the ideal for the Jews, religious ideal, was to be lived in the land. And therefore the hope was for the restoration of Jerusalem. And therefore in remembering its destruction, you are also expressing that hope for return and restoration. Indeed, it's noted, I think it was Samuel Pepys, one of the great British personalities, who visited a synagogue and saw the Jews mourning for Jerusalem, and this has even been attributed to Disraeli as well, and said, a people that continues to mourn for Jerusalem's destruction will surely eventually see its restoration. And so we believe that. We believe that we are back in Jerusalem today, and Jerusalem's significance for us today is the result of this solid devotion throughout history. And I mentioned, it's not just a matter of a dream and of idea of remembering destruction. Whenever we pray, we turn towards Jerusalem. In all our prayers, we pray for the rebuilding and the restoration of Jerusalem. In grace, thanksgiving for every meal, we talk about Jerusalem. So it's an integral part of the Jewish religion. It's not something extraneous. And eliminating Jerusalem is the elimination of part of the Jewish religion. In that sense, it could be compared to the elimination of Mecca from the Islamic tradition, because what Mecca means to Muslims is what Jerusalem meant for Jews, and still has significance in terms of its symbolism, its metaphor, and the expectation for the future. As I mentioned, for religious Jews, the Messianic age focuses on Jerusalem. The final showdown, if you like, takes place in Jerusalem. In that sense, there is a parallel with other Abrahamic religions. So if you say, why do Jews still mourn about Jerusalem? That's almost the same thing as saying, why are Jews still Jews? It's so much an integral part, therefore, of Jewish identity. Now, the question with regards to, therefore, the diaspora is a really good one. And therefore, many Orthodox Jews would say that if you can live in Jerusalem, or if you can live in the land of Israel, and you don't, then you are not being truly religiously devoted. But they would recognize that not everybody can. Not everybody is in a position to be able to do so, and therefore many people are not able to do so. We will discuss also tomorrow those elements within Judaism, both, if you like, of the extreme right wing that are opposed to Zionism, and we will therefore talk about an approach in that regard of those that actually believe that they should not be here. That's very, very few, but there are those, and we need to understand why they think that. And then you have within the more liberal strands of Judaism, those that felt that this was a very nice idea and they respect this idea, but it's not really binding on them anymore. And they can live, they're perfectly happy living Jews and feel that it's just as good to live a good Jewish life wherever they do in the world. But as I will discuss tomorrow, Israel today has become so central in the life of the Jewish people that for 98% of the Jewish people, Jerusalem is still the religious focus of Jewish life, in the same way as you might say the Vatican is the focus of the life of Catholics wherever they were around the world. They can be good Catholics living in different parts of the world, and no one tells them they have to be living in the Vatican, but the Vatican has a central significance for them, no matter how happy and loyal they are in different places where they may live.
One quick question, Rabbi, a follow up on your response on Jerusalem. And so we know that there are no Al-Aqsa mosques there in that place. So with that kind of dream to return and live in Jerusalem, what is the place of Al-Aqsa in the imaginations? I mean,
so again, this really should be discussed, and maybe we can discuss it more tomorrow. But nevertheless, let me say that Orthodox Jews still look forward to the rebuilding of the Third Temple and pray for it. But that Third Temple, as we mentioned yesterday when discussing a little bit about Christianity and the difference between in terms of Judaism and Christianity, the messianic expectation that Jews still had, which was part of the reason why they did not accept Christian claims, was because that messianic expectation is not only an expectation for the return of the exiles and the rebuilding of the temple and the restoration of independent religious life, but also an expectation of an era of universal peace. And if there isn't an era of universal peace, then nothing else is truly valid either. It all comes together. And therefore, that vision of the Third Temple must be a vision that is a universal vision that is acceptable to everybody. The idea that we could build a third temple against the wishes of peoples and their religious feelings and sentiments and cause them pain, even emotional, let alone physical, that should be a completely an anathema. That should be completely unacceptable. The third temple can only be built when all peoples recognize that messianic era and there is an era of universal peace. So how will that be? How will Al-Aqsa still be able to be Al-Aqsa for Muslims and still be the temple for Jews? I don't know. But Nothing is beyond God's powers and limits. And therefore, when that messianic age, in some wonderful way, it will happen. But according to Jewish tradition, it is not possible for us to be able to build the third temple. This is entirely in God's hands. So Jerusalem is dear to us. We remember the destruction of the temple. We pray and we hope for the third temple, but we are not allowed to do any harm to Al-Aqsa. We are not allowed to do anything of any kind of destruction to any person who is a believer on that site. We are not allowed to do anything that seeks to even construct the third temple. And I'm happy to explain why. It's a little bit complicated, but I explain why. But for the time being, please accept that the third temple is seen as something that takes place wondrously in the Messianic era, in an era of universal peace.
Very well. Thank you very much, Rabbi. And I think that is a topic that will be continuously discussed, because that's about the possibility of peace in Jerusalem. Whether or not the dream for the rebuilding of the third temple can coexist with the Muslim belief of the place of Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. So I'm sorry, but we are running out of time. It's already 5 o'clock, almost 4 to 5 o'clock in the evening here in Indonesia. And there are some people who raise their hand, but I'm afraid that we cannot. We may have to do it tomorrow. Also, there are some other questions in the chat box, which we have the record of all those questions. But I was reminded by Pak Zainal earlier, before we started the sessions, there is one question yesterday. If you can maybe give a response in 1 minute quickly about polygamy in Judaism.
Okay.
Questions that are not answered today in the chat box, we will save them, and then we will find time to discuss the in different ways.
So you know that in the biblical narrative, our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they had more than one wife, but they only took more wives if there was a problem in terms of childbearing, or that was generally the practice, and so was normally the Jewish practice. Monogamy is the ideal within Judaism, and that is explicit in the Genesis story. Adam and Eve are one couple, one man, one woman. There it is said, a person shall cleave to his wife and they become as one flesh. So monogamy is the ideal, but polygamy was permitted, as I said, essentially if the first marriage was not able to produce any progeny, any children. However, we have, when you get to the period of the Mishnah and all documentation we have over the period of Talmud, it's very, very rare to find anybody who has more than one wife. Monogamy is the norm. And by the time we get to about a millennium later, there is actually a prohibition issued against polygamy. And therefore, an edict issued by Rabbeinu Gershom, one of the great luminaries in Europe at the particular time. And as a result, since that period, that means for more than 1,000 years, the Jewish world generally considers polygamy to be prohibited. And therefore, polygamy was mandated as an undesirable necessity in the ancient world, but not as an ideal, and it is not practiced today.
All right. All right, thank you. So thank you, everyone. And I think we are approaching the end of the sessions today. Prof. Rabbi, you have spoken almost 2 hours. I thank you so much. And this is a different setting, a conference via Zoom. So usually if we have a direct in-person meeting, we have a more interactive setting of sessions, but this is, I think, also useful for us to learn directly from the authoritative sources of knowledge in Judaism. Of course, our friends here can follow up with the reading, with the text, and all questions you can find the answers in textbooks. but of course, hearing directly from Rabbi, I think is a privilege. Thank you very much. So, Pak Leo, Pak Zen, do you have to mention anything about the organization aspect?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mas Iqbal. Thank you, Rabbi, for the very revealing response to all our questions. I just want to remind you for tomorrow's meeting, we still have 2 other meetings, so don't miss it. And in the end of the meetings, by Thursday and after the meeting, somebody from our committee will send you email to fill the survey. So please pay attention to each session, because then you can say something about each session for our improvement for the next organizing program. So thank you very much for coming, and I think that's it. Zen, do you have something to say?
No, Leo, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
So see you all
Bye-bye.
tomorrow.
Thank you.
Rabbi, I hope you keep healthy.
Thank you very much. And to you all.
Amin.
Thank you,
Amin.
Rabbi.
Shalom.
Okay, bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
Wassalam.
Shalom, everyone.
Wassalam.